Good evening and welcome to BIC Screens in collaboration with Take on Art. Today's session is Indian Fashion Towards Personal Histories. Joining us on today's session are Mayank Mansingh Kaul, who will be in conversation with Bhavna Kakar. Thank you so much for doing this for us, Mayank and Bhavna, and welcome. Before I hand over to our speakers, a few quick instructions. We will be posting the bios of today's speakers on the chat box that you see at the bottom of your screen. Next to the chat box is the Q&A box. Please post your questions in the Q&A box. Do sign up to our mailing list for updates from us. And with that, welcome everyone, and over to you, Mayank.
Thank you, Raghu. Thank you, Bangalore International Center. I'm really happy that we're doing this in collaboration with Take. Bhavna, I'm so happy we're getting finally a chance after 1 year of the special issue of Take on Fashion releasing. We're getting a chance after more than 1 year of its release to actually finally do something to start presenting it in the public, and what better way than a Zoom session like this. For those of you who may not know about this, Bhavna and I collaborated 8 years back in 2012 on a special issue on Indian design. And from then onwards, Bhavna and I have been talking about how there is a need for us to perhaps bridge in some ways this conversation between the visual arts field, which Take on Art largely addresses, and the fashion world, and try and do something that actually creates a conversation. So the seed of the idea of this special issue of Take on Art on Indian fashion was really that. Conventionally, we would have approached this through essays and commissioned articles, as Take on Art usually does. But as we went around commissioning them, we realized for several reasons, the limitations in today's world of actually that kind of a format. Today we're at a time where fashion influencers have a far more visible outreach than fashion publications. We're at a time that people are generating perspectives on fashion on a daily basis, by the minute on Instagram and other social media platforms. And Bhavna and I started discussing if there was a way to actually capture that immediacy at one level about Indian fashion, how it's being actually manufactured, how it's being expressed, what it constitutes in today's time, and how at a second level we could find a way to include these plural perspectives. So really the idea germinated from that. We outsourced in this sense the content of the publication. Conventionally, we would have commissioned articles, like I said earlier, and we had a range of inputs and contributions that came in from across the world, from within the country, on email, on through the social media invitations that Take on Art put out, as well as through an actual physical event at the Bikaner House in Delhi, which was a part of an event in August 2018, which looked at the making of modern India. So that was a physical event through which people came, interacted with us. We were there for about 10 days, brought in family albums, sat with us for hours talking about their perspectives. And in that sense, the special issue of Take on Art on Fashion really became far from the usual way in fashion publication, the usual way through which fashion publications are created, which is from the perspective of fashion designers and makers primarily, to one that could also include makers, people from outside of the within quotations, fashion industry, consumers, people who actually engage with it at a daily level. We've interspersed in the issue, as we're going to show today, images that came in through contributions, as well as other kinds of images that we sourced to sort of tell our story. So this is really a look at a broad century of Indian fashion through personal histories. I'm going to be reading out some of the anecdotes and contributions that came in along with the images. And towards the end of it, we'll have a discussion with Bhavna to get her perspective on how the issue was received. And then, of course, we'll take questions. So to begin with, I find it very important to qualify my interest in doing anything of this sort. And my interest in fashion really was birthed within my own family at a very young age. I come from a family where we have various communities representative. It's a very mixed family across 3 or 4 generations. And I noticed very acutely growing up how all of this manifested in the choice of what people wore, on what choices of how people took from each other within the family, how a very interesting blend of various kinds of culture started expressing itself, and how we became conscious of it as children, of course, at a very later age. But all of these sort of mixed influences really created layers for us to understand larger phenomena, whether it was in art, culture, textiles, fashion. I pursued a degree in textile design at the National Institute of Design, very interested in Indian fashion. And images like the one that I'm showing you, which was really, which was something that I found in a box, in a family in Hyderabad, from a Tamilian Brahmin family in Hyderabad, almost 15 years back, really got me interested in trying to do something in a formal way to actually start unpacking what the kind of layers we see in this image really convey. What do they mean? How has India taken from diverse influences? How have we appropriated that for ourselves? How have we created a different kind of, how have we created different kinds of archetypes of image, of styling, of silhouettes, of ensembles, of the use of materials? And these are the kind of layers that we really, that I really think we need to unpack and start thinking about more. So having qualified that, also wanted to share with you the image of the issue. This is what it looks like. It's a popular image from the 1960s of what was called at that point a midi style inspired salwar kameez or kurta. As you can see, it's a dress which became very popular in North America and Europe in the 1960s, very representative of a certain era of fashion in the early 1960s. And it represents how that was being sort of combined with Indian silhouettes and ensembles to create really something which is in its own way a very new expression for India, while it takes from tradition, it takes from its roots, it takes from its space, and expresses itself in a way that's quintessentially Indian and at the same time could be seen as global at the same time. Well, since we're looking at a century of Indian fashion, the colonial experience comes first to mind. This was the British colonial presence in India, and how in a very short time, Indian dress for men in the country, certainly among certain sections of society, changed drastically. This is one of 3 images that I'm showing from an album from the 1920s and 30s. So I was talking about the first image, that really the layers that India has, that to me represents the complexity of our reality in terms of dress, sartorial styles. And this is one of the images in many ways which I found, like I was sharing in a trunk in a family in Hyderabad 15 years back, that got me started on the journey. I was sharing the cover of the special fashion issue, where you have the midi salwar kurta from a popular image in the 1960s. This is one of the 3 images that I was sharing with you from the album, which was contributed to us by Ahalya Mathan from Bangalore. And this is of her own great-grandfather and her grandfather. And I had begun to talk about how the colonial experience in India, the British colonial experience in India, within a very short time since it was established, actually started transforming the way men dressed among certain sections of Indian society at a very fast rate. The generation before that, within the same family and the same album, captured the gentleman like this, a family from Coorg in the 1920s and 30s, from when the album is dated. And when they held on to dress, which can be traced back to Yemen, I was told that the Kurd community, which is now centered in a certain part of Karnataka in southern India, actually trace their ancestors to sections of Alexander's army who came to India all those hundreds, centuries back, millennia back, and how until about 100 years back, they still kept on wearing elements of Yemeni dress, as we can see in this image from the same album. From the same time, the image of a lady dressed in a Banarsi sari, but in a Kurg drape. And this also brings to light the predominance of Banaras as a major brocade weaving center in North India, not only catering to the North Indian and Western Indian clientele and market, but actually creating special products, as we know from these weaves which were created for Southern India, the Maratha states and the Deccan. And in this case, we see, if I can point out my cursor, the drape, which is a typical Kurg drape, as you can see, which is worn with a headscarf, which is square. Now, just a little note about the sari, something that we take for granted today as a quintessentially pan-India phenomena, was still emerging in the drape that we see in this popular image of the freedom movement. And this image of the sari, where you see the palla or the end drape going up from the left side of the body, actually emerges in a very strong way as a pan-Indian and pan-national phenomena with the emergence of the very idea of India as a country from the late 19th and the early 20th century onwards. So until then, we have evidence and we know that the drapes of India, the unstitched garment as is commonly referred to, was worn differently in different parts of the country, both for women and men. And we see during this time, during the freedom struggle, a way in which it sort of came together to form this idea of what has been often referred to as the Navi Sari or the new Sari. And that image of the sari-clad person then became superimposed on the very map of India, as we can see here, and became synonymous with the idea of Mother India and similar evocations about the struggle of about the Indian freedom struggle and the national movement. It's very interesting to note that we saw in one or two other slides earlier how Western dress for men had actually transformed the way men dressed in India in a very short time. But it was actually the sari and dress among Indian women, which has been recorded and scholars have written about this, which actually kept, sort of in many ways, resisted this idea of the colonial influence. And we see that women's dress, unlike in many other parts of the world where there was European colonial influence, as drastically seen among women, we see, unlike that in India, somehow this space of Indian dress, even though it amalgamated with Western influences, even though it took from foreign materials and influences, somehow this idea of Indian dress kept the freedom struggle, the idea of the emergence of an Indian national movement rooted into a certain kind of local dress or dress sensibility and ethos. Another contribution that came in going again, which is from the 1920s and 30s, came from Sev Habibullah. He's originally from a family in Lucknow. And we're looking at the picture of Begum Inam Fatima Habibullah, his great-grandmother, who was believed to be among the first women who came out in the 1920s of the Parda. At that time, many erstwhile royal families, many aristocratic families, many sections of the mercantile elites were still in Zenana, women from these sections of society, where they didn't participate in public life. And with this image, we sort of get an idea of how women were coming out of the Parda. Sev also shared with us how Mr. Jinnah had invited his great-grandmother to actually set up a women's wing and lead it for the Indian Muslim League. From the 1960s, early 1960s, this is actually an image that contributed by Noni Singh from Delhi, who lives in Delhi today but grew up in Patiala and in boarding school in the Punjab. And I'm going to now read out an extract which illustrates this image and her sort of sentiment behind sharing this with us from the issue. I quote, "The photograph of me in a swimming suit was taken when I was around 14, 15 years old, in the 1950s, studying in a boarding school. I had seen something similar in a movie. We were not allowed to watch films much, or in a magazine. The swimsuits were not very short, till the thighs, and I stitched this one myself with pieces of fabric cotton lying around at home. In fact, while tailors were around and women would order clothes with them, most women stitched themselves at home. We also had a singer machine, and my aunts were also teenagers at the time studying in Queen Mary College, which had a swimming pool. I remember that swimming galas and competitions would be organized there, where they had to wear swimming suits. These memories came back to me in 1954 when I was 18 years old and studying in Miranda House in Delhi. Our principal was very strict, and so we did not have a swimming pool in the college. But once it was decided that us, the students in the boarding, should be taken for swimming at a pool near Janpat, beside stadium, here we were asked to enter the pool in salwar kameez. Can you imagine? We were very shocked. Continuing with the period, we were sent a series of images, of which this is one by Arunima Subramaniam. And this is an image of her parents' wedding in 1961. And this is a family that was living at that time in Almora in Uttarakhand. And they were a Pahadi Christian Rajput family. So one of the intentions of also some of the early photographs that we've taken in the issue was to highlight how these really interesting mixed marriages, which get reflected in personal albums, reflect way people clothes, how they dress themselves up, and also how they posed for the photographs, as we can see in here. This image came to us from Shreya Ray, and again I'm going to read what she sent us, an excerpt that we've included with this image. I quote, "Everything that must go will return. If that's not an adage, it should be. Think of the following scene. A group of women assembled in the central lawns of a colonial-style bungalow, pillars and big wooden doors. The sofa sets are chintz, printed, vintage-looking. It's a party, you can tell. They're gathered in a circle, conversing in groups of twos and threes. Hey, did you hear what happened to Swati? One says. You must be Mrs. Ray, am I right? Another asks. Varying degrees of acquaintances. But there's another set of interactions happening in the same frame. These are the conservatives, the dark rose silk, the grand off-white Bengali garad, the play-safe printed silks. Then there are the flamboyant ones, the whispering organza and wispy tissues, the chiffons with Zardozi work. One of them wears distinct cat-eyed glasses perched on her face. It's the same cat-eye frame I would go on to buy 50 years later in 2010s, a pair of Tom Ford knockoffs in Chandni Chowk. The organza tissue sari was the first one I bought for myself as a 21-year-old. Years of wearing my mother's boring silks, except that 15 years later, boring silks are a big part of my sari collection now. Scrolling down the Instagram posts of designers like Sabyasachi, I see so many of these elements reintroduced in their works, down to the combination of floral meets traditional. I go to Good Earth and see their chintz collection. Then to Amar Colony Market in Delhi looking for floral sofas. I'm laughing hard at myself and our generation for celebrating our youth while obsessing with everything old and vintage. and basically stolen from my grandmother's party from the late 1950s. This scene is somewhere in an army club in Kolkata or Lucknow, and of my grandmother's friends, army wives mostly. My grandmother is the lady with the cat eye. This is one of a set of several images that came to us from Sunaina Suneja. This is from the 1960s as well, and Sunaina's mother, Raj Sunaina, is credited with opening Delhi's first boutique, which was in the Chanakyapuri area of Delhi. And again, I'm choosing, this is of a fashion show of clothes from Raj Creations, from Raj Sunaina's collections, at the American Embassy. There would be fashion shows, and this was also the time that perhaps India first started seeing these kinds of fashion shows. I'm going to quote from the contribution that she sent. This is Sunaina Suneja. I have always been very intrigued by what women wore before boutiques came up. I have been doing a lot of research on khadi and have found that while Mahatma Gandhi promoted khadi, he also understood that in the movement for the boycott of clothes made from foreign cloth, many Indians were not burning these as was being encouraged. This led me to ask my mother whether she wore khadi as a young girl during the national movement. She recalled that her mother used to spin wool, which was picked up by a weaver from her home, and would return it as dyed woven cloth, which was used for my grandfather's coats that he wore as a lawyer. My mother opened her first boutique called Raj Creations after her name in Chanakyapuri in Delhi from her family home itself. This was in 1967 or 1968. Initially, her clients were diplomats who lived in the area, and it was only much later that her clients became Indians. Soon, I started working with her. In those days, we made many Indo-Western dresses, patiala salwars with short westernized shirts, which were a big hit. After that, I suggested that we do some exhibitions where we worked with themes. I remember one collection where we made pants in black and white, many of them in khadi. Within a decade, many of our clients started opening up their own boutiques, probably inspired by what my mother had done. Now, one of the interesting things that post-India inherited were these several strands of aesthetics, which were also moral values related to the politics of the times. So you have on the one hand Gandhian values, you have khadi, the inheritance of handlooms as a legacy of the freedom movement, which enters India's psyche in the post-independence period. But what was also birthed during that time in the late 19th century and early 20th century were Indian mills which were making mill-made cloths. And in many ways, this reached a sort of zenith by the 60s and 70s. And that is a second thread that I'm talking about. You have the world of mill-made cloth that was innovating at a very high level. You had early graduates of art schools, of design schools that were being employed by them to design in their design studios. And all of them were ultimately producing a cloth which was outreach to the whole country through several of their stores. So I thought it would be interesting to intersperse some of these visual narratives, these anecdotes that we got contributions, that we got in the way of contributions from our contributors, with some advertisements, some visual cues that also help us understand how many of these ideas were being disseminated. So here's an advertisement which was published in Mag magazine, which is an art magazine that was founded in the 1940s in Bombay. And this is an advertisement of the calico mills, Calicut, which was a certain fabric which was a mix of polyester and cotton. And by a certain chemical treatment, you could tear away the cotton part of it. So there's this kind of gossamer effect that you see in the sari. And all of this is achieved in what looks like a handloom sari, but in the mill. So Calico Museum was really at the avant-garde at that time. They are believed to have started this idea of traveling fashion shows as a way to actually market their products. So these fashion shows organized by mills would travel to sometimes 20 cities or towns in the country as a way to market. And in publications that have been written of the time, many of these fashion shows have been written about as very, very publicized and looked forward to events in these cities. This is an image more closer home from one of my family albums. The person you see on the extreme left here is my mother in a maxi. And it's from the early 1970s, and it gives an idea of what working women in Indian cities began to wear casually on a day out. This is representative of that. It also in many ways gives us an idea of the way in which Western ideas of the hippie movement, of the floral age, the bell bottoms of the time, sandals, shoes, the use of shades, dark glasses, was being reflected in the choice of Indian women in certain sections of society in urban India. This is a very interesting contribution, this image that came to us from Seema Bhalla. She's an art historian, and she helped us sort of understand what was the world before the arrival of the formal, glamorous fashion designer and the Indian fashion industry. So again, I'm going to quote from what she sent us related to this image. In the mid-1970s, Bombay-based S.U. Zariwala, famous for his embroidered saris seen on the film screen, worn by Hindi film actresses such as Wahida Rehman, Mala Sinha, Babita, Saira Banu, Nanda Sadhana, opened a branch in the outer circle of Delhi's Connaught Place. It closed down a few years later though. His sari designs can be equated with the concept of the embroidered designer saris of today. The preferred materials for the embroidered saris from Zariwala were French chiffons, Indian chiffons, georgettes, and imported synthetics of the 1970s, popularly known as 644 due to its chemical composition. He would often be more expensive or at par with the most expensive woven saris. For embellishment, silk thread, zari, sequins in mother of pearl, plastics, metals, along with glass beads were used. Decades later, one cannot help but admire these two saris from the atelier of S.U. Zariwala, which were a part of my trousseau. So this is one of the two that she mentions here that we are showing. Interestingly, Zariwala's Miami-based son Naeem Khan, known for dressing celebrities like Beyonce Knowles, Carrie Underwood, and Kim Cattrall, among others, became the first Indian designer to dress the First Lady of the United States when Michelle Obama wore a gown designed by him for the state dinner hosted with the Indian Prime Minister Dr. Manmohan Singh and his wife in 1920. So this sort of gives us a sense of how a lot of writing on the subject of Indian fashion, on Indian textiles, has emphasized how important handlooms and the handmade is. And while that has certainly been a very important aspect of India's trajectory, we've often underplayed or not gone in research, in search of, or sufficiently researched this aspect of Indian fashion. Relatively more westernized, which took from elements from across the world, but still molded this into a sort of Indian identity. And I think this is an area that we need to sort of look at a little more, as we need to look at the history of mill production of cloth in the country and its relationship in molding the choices of materials that Indian fashion has often taken at different levels of the Indian market. This is a contribution that came to us from Parul Gupta, and again, a typical middle-class North Indian family that she spoke to us about, where the very event of taking a photograph was something to be looked forward to, that you sort of spent great care in choosing your clothing for. And sorry, I'm just losing the page. where where I can read out an anecdote from Parul Gupta from, and I quote, "My mom was fond of this yellow frock which her elder sister stitched for her. She dragged her to the photo booth to get a nice photo of the two in her favorite dress. Also because her sister was by now married and she couldn't see her as often as before." This is from 1969. This image is something that we chose from the collection of Priya Paul, who has generously contributed to the issue through several images from her collection of calendar art, popular culture, imagery. It's of Sri Devi, the actress Sri Devi, in a Banarsi sari, with the quintessential floral garland that you see on the hair all across states in southern India, but superimposed against the image of a urban city. And it begins to help us understand how many of these ideas of what was traditional were actually being again superimposed, or were being sort of married into this idea of what a new modern country or what a new modern city sort of looked like. From here onwards, covering the areas from the 80s to 90s, we have chosen to look at 10 images that are a part of the issue that come to us from Asha Kocher. She's a Delhi-based photographer and choreographer, production designer. And she was, if not India's first, perhaps one of India's first female fashion photographers. And she's a friend, and one afternoon we were looking at several trunks of photographs from the 80s and 90s that she took. And I found that there was a certain kind of boldness about Indian fashion through her photographs that is expressed here. Let's remember, this was a time that the very idea of the Indian fashion designer as a major public personality sort of emerges. The idea of what he could produce at the level of artistic production is being sort of discussed in a way that hasn't been perhaps discussed publicly in a certain way. The fashion designer becomes a celebrity. It's the early 90s, late 80s, when cable television comes to India. You have the birth of new television channels, and it is possible for a lot of these ideas of Indian fashion to be conveyed and expressed through the medium of television. So the next few images really convey an ethos of a certain time, which could be seen as the birth of Indian fashion as we see it today. It was also economically the period of post-liberalization and reforms. India was changing at a very fast rate. It was linked now to the international economy after decades of focusing on not doing so through economic and financial policies. And a quick sort of glance through some of these images could really help us understand how a new sentiment for the country was being expressed in a very original way. This is Shamali Varma, the supermodel. India during this period also birthed its own generation of supermodels, photographers, choreographers, makeup artists. This is Shamali Varma, a supermodel from the time, who is dressed in Rohit Khosla, also considered among India's first fashion designers. This is an image from the advertisements of a shop in South Extension, which I remember as a child in Delhi, being around for years and years. Walter Johnson, who had a company that was exporting garments to Europe and the Western world. And there was a shop that sort of sold some of the surpluses. It sold garments which were inspired by the kind of collections and garments that were being produced. This is also a time that the garment export industry really receives a big encouragement. From the 1980s, it received several subsidies from the government which enabled it to invest in large-scale manufacturing. This is the time that big brands around the world are being birthed, like Armani, Versace, and are being made into international conglomerates with hundreds of stores. And a lot of that production in its early phases was outsourced outside of these countries to Asia and Africa. And India benefited from that phase of export garment manufacturing to a very large extent. Early expression of an experimental sari. It's a hand-painted sari with a bustier, modeled by Meher Jessia. The garments are designed by Suneet Varma. Again, a work by Rohit Khosla, which gives us an indication of how Indian techniques, elements are being merged with what is sort of a Western international cosmopolitan look with an Indian flavor. Supermodel Feroz Gujral with the designer Rohit Khosla. Ritu Kumar, many have attributed her to have actually birthed the genre of Indian bridal designer wear. And she was an art historian who got involved in textile revival from the early 60s onwards, went in search of block printing techniques, of embroidery techniques, woven techniques that were really, really fast diminishing in the country, and reintroduced them in a contemporary way, both for the everyday occasional wear segment as well as the bridal super high-end couture segment. Just an indication of how many of these techniques in the 70s and 80s were being transformed through this emphasis on export production, but also for the new clientele in urban Indian cities, which were more wealthier than before. There was more purchasing power. So just to give you an example of how Indian techniques were sort of molding themselves and finding themselves into Western or Indo-Western silhouettes. I thought this was again a very quintessential image taken by Asha Kocher of a denim advertisement, which in many ways for me growing up in the 1990s, early 90s, watching MTV, Channel V, represents that MTV generation of a certain kind of boldness, of a certain relationship with Western advertisement and global sort of brand iconography. You have Meher Jessia here, you have Nayanika Chatterjee, again, among India's first supermodels from that generation. Again, from Asha Kocher, an image and of an early David Abraham design. David Abraham is today known for his brand with fellow textile designer Rakesh Thakur as Abraham and Thakur. And this is before Abraham and Thakur was born. This is from David Abraham, you can see. And it's interesting to note that the brand is known for its quintessential use of white and black, which they recur season after season, expressed in very, very distinct and different ways. And it's good to see, it's very interesting to see sort of the birth of that idea in this image. Again, Shamali Varma, photographed by Asha Kocher for David Abraham. We have supermodel Sonalika here now in an image again taken by Asha Kocher. We're not able to say who's the designer, but we're able to see the reference of Indian traditional wear, which is expressed in a very, very new, fresh, innovative sort of language using crinkled cotton. From here onwards, I'm going to go back to reading some of the anecdotes that were referred to us or that were contributed to us for the issue. And having sort of looked at the early 20th century, the mid 20th century, the 60s and 70s through its various threads of the coexistence of the mill sector, innovation in the machine made, the continuing legacy and importance of the handmade and handlooms, we're sort of now moving into the 90s and onwards till today. And this image is by the famous Indian artist and photographer Dayanita Singh, and was contributed to us by Bandana Tiwari, who is the former fashion director for Vogue India. She was the founding fashion features editor, I'm so sorry, for Vogue India, and a fashion commentator. And I'm going to quote what she says about this image. Empathy is everything, and I believe it starts with the gaze. When I see this photograph titled The Chokra Sisters, I feel it. I understand it because I have lived this frozen moment. I see myself as one of them. I don't know them personally. And the rest, my own sisters, poised in a state of calculated indifference. It reminds me of a critical coming of age moment where sartorial grace and a physical stance of this kind exuded a sense of nuanced diffidence against a system that had young women like me straddling two divergent world orders, dogmas of yesterday and promises of tomorrow. And we were fighting to be forward thinking, contrarian, not complying to chauvinistic rules the society exerted upon us. We were also trying to seamlessly align the mind and material towards this conquest of will. And herein lies the significance of this image to me in relation to fashion. Fluid, lightweight, neutral, unblemished. These clothes do not cloak as much as they expose the inner rumblings of untamable minds. Every crease and fold of the pared down salwar kameezes is evocative in the way it languorously thumbs down the annoyance of everyday patriarchy that expects women to be decorated bundles for the male gaze. It is a picture of sartorial modesty defined not by men, but by women who gaze within. This image resonates with my own reality at that time and continues to be my belief that when women are comfortable in their own skin and clothes, it allows their mind to be free to dream of new ideas. I want to believe that it were the winds of change in modern India that wove their clothes. Another contribution from a more recent time came to us from the art writer Avantika Bhuyan. She sent us this image of chikankari, the quintessential embroidery that is associated with Lucknow, and said this about this image. I quote, "Right up to my teenage years, summer holidays meant long train rides from Delhi to Lucknow to visit my maternal grandparents. On weekends of such holidays, I would find myself in a car, bursting to the seams with cousins and aunts, off to a noisy jaunt to the famous Hazratganj area. These trips followed a certain pattern, a long visit to the Universal Bookstore, followed by a quick snack of aloo tikki and mutter chaat, after which we would move on to the long line of shops specializing in chicken curry. This was the highlight of the trip for me, the sound of crisply starched chicken saris being stretched out in front of us, the smell of dhoop or agarbatti emanating from the shops, and the most exquisite floral motifs embroidered on fine cotton muslins. All these came together to form quite a sensory experience." This image came to us from Pakistan, from the artist Samina Islam, who shared an image of her own bridal outfit from about 30 years back now, then 29 when she sent it to us. And she talked about her own practice of how she sort of layers embroidery and all kinds of techniques over these photographs from herself, from her own family album. And I quote, she also sent an accompanying set of images of her own mother, a Dutch lady who married a Pakistani, and how she wore the sari. So the quote will refer to that briefly as well. I quote, "The pictures above are that of my mother from 55 years back. The opposite picture of mine, which is this image that you see, from 29 years back. I worked on these photographs between 2017 and 18. I relate these to fashion in the way that clothes make our identity, and most of my work as an artist is related to questions of identity. My mother is Dutch and loved wearing saris. And I observed that while trends in fashion may come and go, the sari endure. As an artist, I work with photography by combining them with techniques such as needlework and embroidery. I love textiles." What was also very interesting that in terms of feedback that we got, many people, friends who looked at the issue said that textile sort of plays a very important part. And I think that is something that all of us know and have observed and acknowledged, but how is sort of textile essential to the Indian fashion experience is something that became very visible. The tactility of it, the immediacy of it. Also the fact that in many cases, traditions of Indian handmade textiles continue as they have continued for several centuries, several decades, and that they continue to offer a resource for Indian expression, expression among Indian fashion designers, creators, consumers. So that is something that was also very, very palpable. A friend of ours remarked that the issue could be an issue on the sari because there's so many references to the Indian sari in the narrative and in the personal anecdotes that were shared. And I think it's about time that for a long time, saris have sort of been looked at as traditional, as something that don't qualify for the kind of newness, freshness that fashion in a Western context and sort of discussion sort of implies. And it's about time that we started discussing this, the very role, the fact that the sari itself has evolved so much, the fact that it has such a preponderance in the memory of people when you first ask them, you know, about images or associations that come to mind when they think about fashion. And the third thing that was very interesting that came through was how much of fashion as the first association came from the immediate world. It didn't come from the world of street. It didn't come from observing somebody else. It didn't come from looking at you know, ecologies of creative expression. It sort of came from a more immediate world. It came from the home itself. And that is something that I think we really need to also think about and start constituting as a thread or a layer to really discuss in Indian fashion the immediacy of home, which reflects in all of this. The next image is one just to kind of sort of share with you, you know, beginning from this image to this and a couple more that I'm going to show towards, you know, to end the presentation in a few minutes, all sort of come from a space of performance. They really come from a space of staging. They come from the different values that are associated with the idea of cloth when it comes to staging. And so we chose these images because they bring in the performative aspect of Indian fashion. They're not about clothes that are put in or shot alone, really about people who inhabit them and the reasons that they inhabit them at so many different levels. So this is a very interesting project that was done by Pakhi Sen and Samira Bose, and they sent us one of several images. This is one of several images that we published in the issue, and I'm going to quote from what they sent us. Our project began as a fascination with masquerade. Both Pakhi and I were drawn to the manner in which Amrita Sehgal, the famous Indian artist, carefully cultivated her persona and the various attires that she donned. While her exemplification as a pioneering modern Indian artist has been discussed and debated thoroughly, our approach at this point was rather sort of exploratory. We wanted somehow and rather indulgently to embody her costumed approach in representing herself. Ranging from heavily embroidered saris, aristocratic velvets, furs, and loosely draped scarves, her mixed heritage yielded diverse images. More than anything, we noted how Sehgal quite consciously channeled her access and privilege to enter a fairly sedate, male-dominated Indian modern art scene and refused to conform to norms and expectations. Continuing with this idea of performance, this contribution was sent to us by Suhasini Ganguly, and I'm going to quote. India, so diverse in its heritage, traditions, ways of life and fashion, can be a lot more welcoming than you would initially believe. Cosplay, in its most traditional sense, is not restricted to anime or video games. Taken by combining the words costume and play, cosplay encompasses any and all forms of dress up. I once had an uncle who I was explaining this art form to remark, "Why, that sounds like even Jatra might be cosplay." Jatra is a Bengali form of theatre. And indeed, he is right. From little girls who like dressing up like superheroes and princesses to people on Halloween who turn the night into a party for the Walking Dead, cosplay has been around for a long time. So with this and a series of other sort of images and contributions, we wanted to acknowledge, like I said at the beginning of the presentation, the immediacy of how fashion is actually being constructed today, and how in many ways publications that like we do, that we've done, can only represent a certain aspect of this big Indian fashion story. And the fact that we have to find ways to research, to understand, to analyze the relevance of social media, the relevance of theater and film, other forms of performing arts, and how they use dressing up, fashion, clothing, wardrobes, the sense of yourself, makeup, as ways in which fashion is being produced at a very individual level. So one of the things that Bhavna, the editor of Take on Art, has written in the introduction, in the introductory essay, is that there are thousands of Indias, and I think this is one of the ways in which we wanted to capture that in today's age of the internet, globalization, we're also looking at a time where fashion is losing sort of its identity and synonymity as a large system that you cannot resist into one that you can completely subvert and make into your own, and develop parallel universes which simultaneously play with what the very idea of Indian fashion is. This image, again, continuing with the performative aspect of what we're talking about in the issue, came to us from the Jaipur-based curator Himanshu Varma, who runs a company called Red Earth. I quote, "In this performative work, responding to images of women created by Raja Ravi Varma, I'm hoping to problematize the relationship of the viewer and the protagonist of the painting as seen in his works. Most of Varma's paintings in this genre portray coy, demure, seductive women who are shown as happy, sometimes objectified subjects of the male gaze. Here, the dialogue is problematized by the very fact that the subject is a man dressed in a sari, posing as a Varma's version of a Nayika. In this work, the inversion is achieved subtly. The gentle, seductive gaze of the subject is maintained." Another contribution that came to us by Nikayata, and a project that she has started about experimenting with different drapes of the sari. Again, only reinforcing that even today in the 21st century, 100 years after the Navi drape of the sari was invented or emerged, the sari is something which still fascinates those who engage with Indian fashion. It is something that is constantly being experimented with, innovated with, and that it is being used through the medium of photography and social projects like the one that Nikayata has initiated to really bring attention to many other layers of fashion, whether it's gender, whether it's the gaze, whether it's the politics of image making itself, the kind of aesthetics and visual worlds that they occupy, and all of these, and what all of these together say. To bring the presentation to a conclusion, I'm leaving this sort of one of the last, I think it's the last image. Yeah, it's the second last image, with a project which takes on this idea of fashion not as product, not as dress, not as an ensemble, but as a performance, as actually a ritual. And you have a project that was presented by Meetu Sen, a Delhi-based artist, for an art and fashion collaboration called the Idea of Fashion, which I co-curated with Coach, an artist residency in Delhi in 2011. And what she did was for 2 weeks, she was in this room that you see, and she suddenly started scraping the freshly painted walls of the studio that she was occupying for 2 weeks, and started discovering these layers of, of, of remnants and residues from previous residencies that artists may have left behind. And in that sense, she made fashion really about the ritual of seduction. In this case, not of a person, not of a situation, but that of a room, and the various of what you would call an inanimate object or an animate object, depending on how we look at it. And she actually sort of started looking at the layers between this area of what is an object and what is not an object, what is a room, what is a space, through this idea of fashion as a ritual, and started discovering these remnants that were left behind by previous residencies. And finally, I'm ending this presentation with an image that I particularly love very much. It came from Gopesh Singh, who is a travel curator. And this is from one of his visits to Orissa. And he wrote to us about how it was perhaps one of the first times that he actually saw a sari being woven. And in this case, it's an ikat. And how it sort of defined for him everything that was wrong about fashion, that an image like this took him to something that was unchanging, that was classic, that was enduring. And both because I work in textiles and also because I'm constantly looking at the intersections of where tradition ends, where something new starts, what is tradition, what is contemporary, what is fashion. This image sort of, I wanted to end with this because he sent it to us as sort of a critique of everything he observes to be wrong with Indian fashion, and how in many ways it has, over the last several decades, moved away from this idea of dress and embodying several layers of a culture in a product, like we do, like he feels we do in a Orissa ikat sari. May I ask, may I ask Raghu and Bhavna to join us now? I mean, Bhavna, I think it may be interesting because, you know, we did this as a collaboration between Take on Art and me to, you know, I mean, it would be interesting for me to sort of remember the time that we were trying to look at this idea of the commission article, and we were constantly coming upon this roadblock about not having enough writers who could actually, who could perhaps write in the way that a contemporary art sort of magazine could carry. So could you share that time and then how we sort of evolved this model?
Yeah, I think it's the only issue we've done, and we are on to our 26th, I would say 27th issue now. Take is in its 10th year this year, and most of it, which has been in lockdown. But we worked on the design issue earlier in 2011, which was great fun, and we had, of course, contributions from all kinds of people. But with fashion, I think we started, I remember our first meeting was with Mala Singh. And I mean, before we'd been discussing the issue for many, many years. And when we sat down to planning it, and we thought we'd make a list of 100 fashion icons of India. And you remember that day in Bikaner House where we made a list of 300 people, you know, who could be like contributors to this, and like, you know, and one person we would have somebody commenting on them, or they would contribute. And then we changed it to, because it was, of course, it would have been very difficult to put that together, which we realized very much in the beginning, though Mala was very very supportive and said, no, we can do it, and you must do it in this format and all of that. And then and then Jaipur, we were together when you had your textile exhibition, and how then we discussed that maybe we take the format of the evolution of textile and fashion together. And and then we realized how difficult it is to find writers in the field of fashion, with knowledge of archives and history and all of that put together.
And
So
somewhere I think that's also the sort of area that we explore, because as people who are interested in looking at fashion from discursive aspects, from curatorial perspectives, we're sort of, we're constantly moving between writers who write very well for popular publications, and then for niche and academic publications. And as something that, as an idea and as an idea, as a concept that excites so many sections of society, how do we actually start? I mean, in many ways, this could be seen as the first of what could be several projects in the future done by several other people to actually problematize this idea and to actually face this idea of how do we engage with different ways of writing about fashion that can address the reality of the fact that fashion, more than art, more than perhaps any other form of creative expression or media, really reaches out to the maximum number of people. And how do we actually then engage with it as a field of study?
yes, that's true. And I would say that, we were talking of you were talking about feedback earlier, and this has been one issue that has had tremendous feedback from all walks of life, everybody, because fashion is the way we live, right? It's everywhere. It's quoting my own editorial again, Coco Chanel, I quoted, said, fashion is not clothes, it's the sky, it's the way we live, it's the way we walk, what we see around us. So this was one issue, because most of our issues all of our issues are theme based and tend to be on the academic journalistic side, which caters to, whatever said and done, very few people. Art is anyways niche, critical writing even more niche, and the themes we take up sometimes, though some of them have been international issues with contributions from everywhere, but still the kind of feedback. And of course we saw that when we did the the live interaction, Bikaner House, where people from my social media, your social media, from Take, from the mailers, all of that, they walked in, contributed. People I didn't even know would ever be interested in fashion. You remember the artist Hema Guha, who
That's right.
contributed with the magazine covers, and Tanmoy, who's a contemporary artist who created those little watercolors for us for this issue, which were, I think, inspired by the Vriksh.
It was by a ritual in Shantiniketan Art College, and how for him,
That's right.
being in Shantiniketan, the word fashion sort of became associated with this day of dressing up with flowers, which is something that
Yes.
in many cultures across the country, we continue, in certain kinds of sacred festivals. But here it was a way of bringing the community of a university together. So he wrote about that. I remember Hema's contribution because she shared with us pages from a magazine called Chic Magazine, and how these were sponsored by cotton mills.
Magazine, yeah.
So these magazines were actually sponsored almost entirely and published by mills, because the mills would sell fabric, and then the magazines became a way of actually putting out different kinds of drapes and patterns. It actually provided patterns that you could then use that fabric to convert into product at home. So it was very interesting how so many of these layers about Indian fashion. And I think somewhere also one of the things that Bhavna and I discussed through the issue was that, at a time that people are used to looking at Instagram and social media, looking at short form content, is there a way for us to finally acknowledge that needs to find a voice in also, physically published publications, and that is pretty much the reflection of the time that needs to be captured?
we actually took the social media format into print, so in that sense. And maybe we could just share too, for those who've not seen the issue, a glimpse of the PDF, the layout, so it gives a sense of how you wove the whole issue together, because there were these anecdotes, but then it was ultimately your writing that connected from 20s onwards to the current issue. Raghu, would you have the PDF with you? And can it be
yes.
shared, or maybe Indira can? If you can just scroll and so Mayank, would you want to comment on the
So
format?
I mean,
20s
do you want to look at 2 or 3 layouts, and then I could briefly comment?
just scroll through the PDF.
Well, I mean, for something like this,
just scroll through the
yeah.
PDF.
So for instance, in something like this, we are sort of looking at, I began the issue by actually looking at my own family archives and albums, and trying to understand how, that links to what we wear at home, and how it sort of informs a worldview that we occupy, and our concepts of fashion within our 4 walls of the house, and how that has influenced our notions of dress. And so how we sort of looked at the layout was really, I mean, if you look at where I'm looking at the, space like this is from Ahalya Mathan's contributions. Now you see the 3 images I showed earlier as a layout. We actually had a quotation from the person talk about it, but if we could go to the previous, something like this. I also then interspersed this with a sort of a text that could pull all of these different memories and anecdotes into a kind of chronology. So there are really 3 layers to the issue. One is the visual memory, one is the text memory, or the oral memory, because so much of what we've actually reproduced in text was really conveyed to us orally through the phone, through personal interactions. And then intersperse this with a commentary from my side, which tries to pull all of this together to understand a kind of evolution and place the personal memories in a certain chronology, so that it becomes an offering to the field that could also help place different stylistic movements, different influences within a kind of systematic chronology. So these are the 3 layers through which the issue sort of moves.
Do we have some more slides of this, Raghu?
No, that's all I have.
Just
Great.
scroll through the PDF.
Yeah.
Just to give a sense to the, great. I think it also kind of stressed on the importance of archiving when we were doing this, right? Like we wanted to find references. People hadn't had scans of the photographs they have.
I think we have some questions piling up.
This is a question from Georgina Maddox. A lovely presentation, Mayank. She wants to ask about Gandhiji as the naked foot, as a very powerful gender non-conforming image during the freedom struggle. Did you intentionally not touch upon it when talking about Khadi?
Well, we've touched upon Khadi, and it makes an appearance, and we've looked at how Khadi is sort of received by us through different kinds of visuality. But yes, I did not want to overemphasize it, because in the past there have been publications devoted to Khadi. And also because what happens is that often in the highlighting of Khadi as such an important aspect of the Indian national movement, which of course it was, we forget some of the lesser known narratives. One is which we've covered in the publication, the arguments against Khadi. So there were several national leaders like Sarojini Naidu, like Kamla Devi Chattopadhyay, even Kamla Nehru herself, who were opposed to Khadi because they felt that austere white Khadi, as it offered itself as a leveler for the Indian national movement across the region, the subcontinent, it evoked ideas of widowhood for women. Many people also felt that Khadi would actually kill. The emphasis on very simple, coarse, hand-spun cotton would kill the different artistic ways in which textile traditions have been which have endured across centuries in the Indian subcontinent. So there were concerns about that. People like Ambedkar and Rabindranath Tagore have actually gone on record to say how they disagreed fundamentally with the idea of Khadi as enabling economic resurgence, because they felt that India should industrialize. They felt that some of these dissenting voices against Khadi felt that India should industrialize, that it should not. They felt that handloom and hand technology would keep us or regress us. So, there are different aspects that we've looked at through the national movement. Other aspects that we've highlighted in the issue include from the royal families. You had, while they supported Khadi at a public level as a political statement, they posed in posters spinning. You had Maharajas and Maharanis who would pose in their palaces spinning, and those photographs and images would then go on to popular culture as a way to build consensus around Khadi. They themselves personally wore European brocades, they wore European fabrics. I think in one of the anecdotes that I read out, which are among the few that we've included in the book, there's talk about how, when the boycotts used to happen, people have memories that their grandparents and parents would keep mill-made cloth on the top of a cupboard so that nobody could see, because they felt that it would be a short-lived sort of movement, and that when time would be right, they would bring out all of this mill-made fabric and they would wear it. So there was a genuine fondness. Let's not forget that while there was a tremendous anti-British sentiment colonially, anti-colonial British sentiment politically, India was taking, whether in terms of cuisine, food, whether it was in urban planning, whether it was in education, they were taking hugely both from Britain as well as from other parts of Europe. So there was a genuine interest in European sensibilities and aesthetics, which got amalgamated in different ways. So the idea is to really expand the idea of what happened, or what happened in fashion, what happened in dress and textiles during the national movement, and to address the fact that there were several threads of conversations around these issues, and that the predominance of Khadi didn't take away from that. If at all, these dissents only enabled the national movement, because you had Indian industrialists who then set up mills as a way to establish their own sort of independence in manufacturing and so on. So we've not chosen to underpress the role Khadi and Gandhi had. We've only chosen to present it in context of other developments of the time.
Thank you for that, Mayank. The next question is from Gopal Mirchandani, who asks, in this age of hyper-nationalism, do you sense a harking back to the past, like in politics, in contemporary fashion?
I think we're at a time that, from what I observe about contemporary fashion and the various ways it's expressed, whether it's at the level of mass market, retail, high-end fashion designers, streetwear, the export industry, as well as the way people sort of use all of these elements in individual styling. I think we're really at a time that, all of it is happening. At the same time, you have a strata, or you have a layer within India which is participating in very international ideas about what's dress. Some of those international ideas are sort of leading themselves towards global ideas which everyone can relate to. At the same time, you have the dominance of khadi, of handloom. I mean, I don't think there's any ecology in the country, in the world today, where contemporary fashion uses so much of that. You have the evocation of India's rich textile history to suit certain agendas of hypernationalism. So you have rhetoric about, you know, the great Indian civilization, which has had exquisite textile manufacturing for the last 10,000 years, 8,000 years, 5,000 years. You have that kind of hyper-nationalism being evoked uh, at multiple levels. I mean, there's so much, and all of that is sort of in many ways, in many ways, it coexists. So, in many ways, what is interesting to see is that what we would consider contradictory phenomena from a certain perspective actually may be received as the existence of all of these multiple and plural points of view which coexist. I think in India today, we're really looking at, you know, you have the rise of the Ambedkarites, for instance. You know, we grew up with this idea of Khadi and Gandhi as an extremely moral one. Today, you have a lot of Ambedkarites who are beginning to question this idea of handloom and Khadi in the same way that Ambedkar has been quoted as you know, as holding. So you have so many ways in which nationalism is expressed in dress. You have so many ways in which, you know, points of view opposing that are expressed. I think it's a time where there's a great commingling and coexistence of different archetypes. And but one thing largely that, you know, has been sort of observed, that, you know, the 20 years back, 30 years back, when India opened up to the world economy, as it were, post reforms, there was this kind of concern that, you know, we would lose a lot. We would lose a lot of what we consider Indian. And it's interesting that today all of that is coming back in a very, very interesting way. So some of those concerns have sort of, you know, international brands, when they came to India, the threat was that they would kill Indian hand craftsmanship, they would kill Indian businesses, and none of that we've seen really happen in the way that, you know, the anxiety would have, you know, led us to believe at that point. So what is interesting is all of that, like I've said, that, you know, all of that exists today, and we're really at a time where India is one of the most exciting cultures experimenting with fashion, dress, and textiles. I don't think we find this kind of diversity anywhere in the world.
The next question, Mayank, is from Shobha Narayan. Mayank, you talk about the evolution of the sari. In that context, given that many women wear the sari as professional or occasional wear, will the sari die or at least shrivel because of COVID, because of work from home?
Well, we don't have statistics to prove that. I know there's been a lot of allusion to that, because people have been hectically posting themselves wearing half saris, not wearing saris. We don't really have statistics that I have accessed or that I believe have actually been, you know, analyzed or put together in a formal way that could tell us about this. There is an understanding largely that the sari is diminishing from its role in public life, and that in certain parts of the country, the salwar kameez has taken over the sari as a more perhaps functional garment. In certain parts of the country, denim is taking over in a big way. So I don't really know. I mean, I don't think that it would be fair for me to, you know, sort of comment on this in an authoritative way. I'm not really aware of statistics that show that the sari will diminish because of COVID. From the small circle of colleagues, peers that I have interacted with, they have really worked hard to make sure that, you know, whether it's at the level, organizations working with handmade production, handlooms, have found a way to get help that they need and to see themselves through during this period. but that perhaps maybe from a small network. So again, I won't use that as a template. But I think more than anything, I've seen that during this time, the sentiment to sort of look at artisanship, craftsmanship has increased, if at all. I mean, India's leading fashion magazine, Vogue India, has put out an entire craft issue right now, which focuses on questions of sustainability and karigars. So if mainstream organizations that earlier did not devote so much of time and effort and editorial to these areas are beginning to feel the need to do that, it certainly is a comment that influential sections of media are beginning to look at this and give it attention. So I think that there's definitely, I feel, been more discussion about the need to revive and to continue these modes of production by hand in textile and fashion than I've not heard. So
We have a question from Hema Malani. What about the Indian fashion influence on European fashion around the end of the 19th century and early 20th century? Any thoughts on the evolution of accessorizing aspect of fashion?
so just to clarify, this is India's influence on international or Western fashion.
Yes, yes, yeah.
Okay. Again, we haven't I mean, I don't know of anyone who may have substantially studied this. We do know that Western fashion from its beginning has taken from influences around the world, whether it was the Great Orient, whether it was Africa, different parts of the world. But we don't really have, I don't know of anyone who may have substantially studied this. And I personally have not, so I wouldn't be able to comment on this in any sort of meaningful way. But we do know that the larger idea of the Oriental, that India was fitted within this larger idea of the exotic Oriental, and that this idea existed for several hundreds of years from the 1700s onwards. So we do know that India has always fitted from then onwards within the larger idea of the Oriental and the East. To what extent it has intentionally contributed or influenced Western fashion in the late 19th century, early 20th century, I wouldn't be able to comment substantially or in any authoritative way.
Thank you for that, Mayank. We now invite Srinjita Biswas to unmute herself and make a comment.
Here, Mayank, and she worked closely on the issue, if you remember. So
I'm glad that Srinjita has been able to join us along with Ayushi Kaul and Suyashi Smridhi were the main team members from Take when we actually worked on the issue and did the first series of interactions.
Yes, Advait also in the beginning, if you remember. Yeah, so
Advait Singh as well.
So we could.
Yeah, Srinjita, can you speak?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, yeah.
Hi, thank you, Mayank. Thank you so much for such a wonderful presentation. And I think Saturday evening wouldn't have been better. And Bhavna, thank you so much for letting me know about this. It really brings back a lot of memories, very fond memories of working on this very special issue, I feel, because as a student of history, I have always, especially cultural history, I've always been fascinated with what we call the material culture, and I feel fashion forms a very important part of what we when we try and define culture. So for me, it also nourished the fact again and again how fashion has always been an extension of us, of people, of human bodies, of identities, how it has always projected. And one very important, I think, one very important aspect that Mayank brought up today during his presentation was on the, the history of mills, which became, I think, very important. And I got to thinking that, for example, one of the first textile mill strikes in Bombay happened in 1919, where all the workers went on strike. They were protesting against the colonial government, and it was also led by Tilak, which later they happened to be the extremist wing of the of nationalism. Yes. So it was very interesting how these mills also became the site of protest, and it also nurtured the fashion that was somewhere how we link these two, fashion and protest. And I think that became very important when Mayank called out. And again, if we now recall in 2000, few years back, when the government sold out these lands of the mills, then again, so I would want to know from Mayank, like when it comes to the Bombay mills, which are historical in itself, and which kind of gives us a lot of materials to work on. How do you think it has, like, one aspect we know, as you were saying, the new Sari, the new tradition, the Navi Sari that you were saying. So with the ousting out of these mills, now where do you stand? Where do they stand in this broader specter of cultural understanding in contemporary India?
Well, I think because of the morality of handloom and handmade production and the influence of certain tastemakers in the country in the post-independence period, which sort of emphasize this need to keep the handmade alive, we've sufficiently, like I said earlier, we've not sufficiently really looked at the history of the mill sector at all and its impact. I mean, considering that India has among the largest textile mills in the world, we are the largest denim producer, for instance, in the world. We have some of the most leading state-of-the-art technologies that exist around the world in mill production. So I think all of these histories have really not been sufficiently analyzed in terms of the impact on Indian fashion, and we need to do that. But just to kind of pick up on two threads that from what you earlier talked about the importance of mills as a site of protest. What is interesting is that Gandhi, and also to kind of address, to go back to Georgina's question, Gandhi set up Sabarmati Ashram in Ahmedabad, and one of his biggest funders was Ambalal Sarabhai, the owner of Calico Mills. And what was interesting was that Ambalal Sarabhai's own sister, Anusuya Ben Sarabhai, was a trade union movement. She was very closely associated with Gandhi. And she was, while Gandhi received this patronage from Indian industrialists, he also encouraged people like Anusuya Sarabhai in this case to have strikes against her own brother, in the mill, to fight for labor rights within the own mill. And the fact that Ambalal Sarabhai has been recorded to have supported his sister's rights, even though she was from the same family and was the beneficiary of the wealth that was generated from the family. She also encouraged his own sister to lead these strikes. So it's very interesting that you have this. The other, you have the coexistence of all of this, and very, very interesting legacy of the national movement that I think we've not sufficiently looked at. We've not acknowledged the Indian industrialists enough for their role in sort of charting an independent space for Indian industry at a time that we were the subject of a colonial empire. In the 1980s, when the Bombay mills shut down, both the Ahmedabad, large number of mills in Ahmedabad and Bombay shut down, and almost overnight, to use a crude term, there was mass-scale unemployment because these workers found themselves out of jobs. And we've also not sufficiently looked at the livelihood implications of that mode of production in the history of Indian textiles. So we speak a lot about the displacement that machines have caused due to the decline of handlooms in the country. But we've sufficiently not looked at the human costs of certain kinds of industrial practices which allow owners to exist without acknowledging labor rights and enforcing them, and for the labor movement to be sufficiently organized to be able to demand better from these industrialists. So these are all aspects of the Indian textile story which really haven't been sufficiently looked at. And I have to say that with my own background of a certain kind of design education, my own entry into the world of fashion and textiles from certain perspectives, one had for a long time not thought about this because we were so invested in the morality of the handmade. So these are questions that really are important to look at. And so much of what is being produced in the mill sector in the country today is going abroad. We don't even get to see it in the country. And it's important that our own writing, research, and curatorial efforts, it's sort of like, these Indian chintzes that were being, everybody talks about, were being produced in certain parts of the country in the 1700s and were going all around the world. And we don't find similar specimens of those in India. And so there are so many pockets of what India is producing that haven't come into the realm of research. My own personal effort as a writer and curator has been that we start at least looking at overviews of these kinds, so that we can then at least map out what are the areas that need more work. And there's a lot to be done. I think we need a tremendous amount of effort to look at all of these areas which haven't been looked at from the discursive perspective. To answer your question shortly, I think these are areas which really need to be looked at. They really need to be looked at. We need to look at, and we need to look at it. We need to look at them from the aesthetics point of view, how they're informing a certain aesthetic in the country, how they are informing a certain use of technology. We have to look at them from the perspective of how they further go back and influence the handmade sector. We also have to look at the human costs and the livelihood implications as equally in the machine sector as we are looking at. But just to give you an example, I travel extensively through the country, and wherever I go and see that, regions where women are wearing polyester saris, probably being bought at 200 and 250, 500 rupees, many of them have motives which take from Indian bandhani, Indian ikat. So that sensibility, the technology may have changed, but the sensibility continues. And that is something we need to look at. How has the handmade influenced the mill-made sector and vice versa? And why is it that there are certain aesthetic impulses that refuse to leave us, no matter what, and no matter how technology moves?
Bhavna, do you want to say something?
No, I was just commenting on the last, about Shobha Nair, and she'd asked about where saris. But don't you see, Georgina's also just commented, what about this hula hoop sari woman who became totally viral on.
Totally.
Is it that the last 2-3 years, I think maybe 5 years, have seen a revival of the sari with the young generation? Is it because of these new brands coming in? Is it because it's become cooler to wear a sari? Or is it just that we see it on social media because people post their photo when they wear a sari? Somebody like me does that. So is it, do you have the statistics for it? I'm really interested.
I actually don't. I don't have the statistics. And if anyone listening to us has statistics about this emergence of the sari in the last 5 years, please share with us. But definitely, one thing is that it has reinserted itself in the Indian psyche of fashion makers in a way that, had begun to sort of get ambiguous in a period before that. Handlooms have come back in a big way. The questions that, these sort of social media-led exercises or or projects leads us to is, how much of what is being talked about as handloom is actual handloom. How much of this reinterest in the sari is in the handloom? How much of it has not moved to new materials which are being expressed in the way of the sari? And we have to also examine, how the sari within this context has evolved. Is it really a sari anymore? When it becomes a dress that you can stitch on and wear, is it a sari? Is it not? Is it not a sari? So I think I'd agree that, the general, certainly from our colleagues, the worlds that we occupy, which we have to admit largely is a certain kind of urban focused network. Certainly you would see that there is a reinterest in the sari, but that cannot be the lens through which we sort of can view the rest of the country as well, because on the streets we definitely see that there is a distinct decline of the number of women wearing saris.
And the popular sectors like corporate, all of that, they've just done away with sari as only hospitality, I think, and a few other sectors have it as a uniform.
And yet, whenever the biggest, or the not biggest, but the most influential women business leaders pose for photo ops of business magazines, they're always in saris, whether they're bankers, whether they're economists. So that's also interesting that as a formal wear among leaders of certain industries, it doesn't seem to go away.
Culture, definitely.
I think it may be for us to now kind of time to step back and say, what will happen if the sari disappears? As a project, because I think we are so invested in its idea, it may be worth looking at the fact that what if it didn't exist? And what if it didn't exist in a certain way? What would we lose? And why are we holding on to it in the way that we visibly see it being held on to?
But fashion brands probably revived it because there are sales also, right? Because they're not just doing it for charity or just to promote handloom.
I mean, we have to also see that there are more occasions for people to wear saris today, also within certain formats. Earlier a wedding would be a 2-day affair. Today it's a 1-week affair. So a person who would typically buy 2 saris for a wedding is, among certain sections of the market, is possibly buying 6 today. The number of people being invited to weddings pre-COVID have increased. So, you have far more occasions. But in that sense, people are buying, certainly before COVID, people were buying more clothes in general. So that also reflects this idea that, there are more opportunities to wear clothes than there were perhaps 5 years before.
True.
Thank you, Mayank, on that note. And Bhavna, thank you so much for taking us on a lovely journey of Indian fashion. And I think it was much more relevant when you strung those strongly personal narratives together with a larger context of the evolution of Indian fashion in India. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you, audiences, for joining us this evening.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Raghu. Thank you, Ravi. Thank you, the Bangalore International Center.
Thank you.